Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Follow Up. My name is James. I'm here with our lead pastor, Scott Beckenhauer, and we've been in this series called Strong and Courageous. And Scott, it's been a great series, but can you tell us a little bit just kind of about what we've been talking about these last couple of weeks?
Yeah, absolutely. We've been unpacking the book of Joshua. So it's the sixth book of the Old Testament, and it's just that storyline of the nation of Israel has come out of slavery in Egypt. They've been wandering in the wilderness. They get to the edge of the promised land, and Moses dies, and then this is the passing of the baton of leadership from Moses to Joshua. And Joshua is told from the get-go, be strong and courageous. Be strong and courageous.
Yeah.
Be strong and courageous. He was told that 3 times there in the first chapter. And because what was before him was the biggest challenge he would ever face in his life, leading the nation of Israel into the promised land that at the time was just filled with a godless people, godless armies, people who wanted to crush them. And God was saying, hey, it's time to go in and take this land that I've promised to my people.
Yeah, so this is kind of the culmination of the Israelite story so far. This is the thing they've been waiting for multiple generations, and kind of that God has promised them, and they're kind of excited to finally take this. And all of a sudden you see Moses, he dies, he passes away, and now it's like this uncertainty. He raises up this new leader to kind of take the reins. And so that's what we've been talking about. But this week we are in the Joshua chapter 7, and we kind of talked about this. This is just after everything at Jericho happened,
right?
Where they marched around and the walls came down. And you see this like God's presence is here with these people, and then what happens right after that?
Yeah. So what we know something Joshua doesn't know. Yeah. And that is that, God gave this very clear instruction. When you go into Jericho, don't take anything. Don't plunder the city.
So after the city walls fall, don't touch anything.
Don't touch anything there.
Was that normal?
Not their gold. It actually wasn't, because later God would give permission, but it was like later on he had that blessing planned for them that even what was left over they could take. But at this time, the story of Jericho was don't take anything. It was like the first step. For whatever reason, it was just that first step. Don't take anything. No gold, no silver, no livestock, no clothes, nothing. And what we know is that one guy, his name was Achan, he goes in and he kind of looks around and he ends up taking gold, silver, and it says, and then an expensive robe. He hides it. Somehow he gets it back to his own tent at the camp. He hides it in the corner of his tent and thinks nobody knows. So then the story, that's kind of the background of Joshua chapter 7. So at the beginning of Joshua 7, then the next city that they go to take is this city called Ai. It's just spelled A-I. And they go up, he sends spies up, they come back and say, hey, it's a small town. It's going to be a piece of cake. You only need to send 2,000 to 3,000 soldiers up. They go up. They get in this battle. There's a clash at the city gates. It says 36 of the Israelites died there, right? And then it says, then they began to flee. And it says that the Amorite army, right, then they began to chase them from the city gate as far as the stone quarries. They've actually, historians, archaeologists know where this area is. It's really cool when you dig into it. But it says, and they struck them down on the slopes. So steep territory, and this army just cuts them down. And then it gets to this turning point of the passage there, where it says that the people of Israel, that their hearts melted and in fear and became like water. Because up until this point, like they've seen the crossing of the Jordan, right? Yep. They've seen the crossing or the taking of Jericho and the miraculous walls falling down. And all this, like, hey, God is for us. He's taking us into the promised land. Now
He's preparing us to take this thing.
Melting in fear. And then that bubbles up to the leader. Right?
Yeah.
And it's Joshua, and that's where it picks up in Joshua 7, verse 6.
Okay, so I'll start reading that. It says, then Joshua tore his clothes and fell face down to the ground before the ark of the Lord, remaining there till evening. The elders of Israel did the same and sprinkled dust on their heads. And Joshua said, alas, sovereign Lord, why did you ever bring this people across the Jordan to deliver us into the hands of the Amorites to destroy us? If we only had been content to stay on the other side of the Jordan. Pardon your servant, Lord. What can I say now that Israel has been routed by its enemies? The Canaanites and the other people of the country will hear about this, and they will surround us and wipe out our name from the earth. What then will you do for your own great name? The Lord said to Joshua, stand up. What are you doing down on your face? Israel has sinned. They have violated my covenant, which I commanded them to keep. They have taken some of the devoted things. They have stolen. They have lied. They have put They have put them with their own possessions. That is why the Israelites cannot stand against their enemies. They turn their backs and run because they have been made liable to destruction. I'll not be with you anymore unless you destroy whatever among you is devoted to destruction. Go, consecrate the people. Tell them, consecrate yourselves in preparation for tomorrow. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. There are devoted things among you, Israel. You cannot stand against your enemies until you remove them. So we see this kind of this story where Joshua, he's like crying before God, asking God, what happened? Yeah. Like, I thought we were on this path. You saw us rescue us from the Jordan. Is it because we weren't content back there? We thought this was what we were promised. Like, he's confused, and he's, kind of going before God being like, we didn't do anything wrong. Right. To his knowledge, right? To his knowledge.
He has no idea what's happened.
Yeah. And so and we see in verse 10 that God tells him, like, no, you have sinned. You violated this covenant, and some of these things, what I've asked you to do and asked you to keep, you've tried to like go behind your back and do this. And so what does this kind of do to a leader when they're trying to like lead this people and like uphold the covenant, feeling like he's probably responsible?
Right. Yeah. I mean, to hear those words, like James, you understand leadership too. And as you're growing in your leadership role, there's times where you feel responsible, right? And to think that, man, God said this, here's what we need to do, and then somebody doesn't follow that. And sometimes you see it, sometimes you don't, right? There's times where, and in this situation, Joshua doesn't know. I mean, he gave the command, hey, don't take any of the plunder from Jericho. The city walls fall, they do their thing, and then all of a sudden, here they are, and they're going to Ai, and their people are cut down, and now he's feeling the weight of, like, I can't imagine the weight of these decisions. I know some of our military community would, but like to think about, he sent these 2,000 to 3,000 guys up, and it says a bunch of them, 36 were dead at the city gate, right? Where they had,
and then they were chased down.
Then they were chased down and cut down on the slopes, it says. So now think about how many families are grieving and wailing, and they've lost their sons and their fathers, and I mean, it's just absolute destruction. And it says they have taken, they have lied, they have stolen. So Joshua's probably thinking, who is this? Later we find out there's a guy named Achan. We go through this story. He tells them to consecrate themselves, right? He says, Joshua, get up, you got to do something about this sin. And then they go through that process. The rest of Joshua 7 is they find out as this guy named Achan and his family. And his family probably knew because they probably shared a tent. And so when it says they, that kind of struck me yesterday. It says it was Achan, but my guess is that those who were with him knew what he had taken, and they were also hiding in that. So that may well have been the they that he was referring to. But man, it's amazing what happens. How sin can just start as a thought, and how it eventually leads to destruction.
Yeah, and I think even some of the they, it could also just be referring to like the people as a whole, right? This idea of like my sin doesn't affect me. This is a communal thing. Yep. And so when God's people, when people that are supposed to be God's chosen people, when one person violates the covenant, the community violates the covenant as well. And that's like also kind of a dangerous thing. But yesterday we talked a little bit kind of how sin begins and how it can take like a foothold kind of in our life. Can you kind of walk us through a little bit of like that progression that we talked about yesterday?
Yeah, James, absolutely. I think many of us probably understand sin. When we hear the word sin, it's disobedience towards God. It's missing the mark, as my friend Nathan says. There's this time where it's just like we're just off center from where we should be. From God says one thing and we go and do another. But most of us just don't randomly all of a sudden, I'm sinning. I had no idea. It usually starts off with a thought. We start thinking about doing something that God said not to do. Don't lie, don't steal, don't cheat, don't commit adultery, whatever the things are. I mean, sin is all throughout the Bible. We see this, no greed, no lust, all that. And it starts as a thought, and we begin imagining what would my life be like if I did that, if I pursued that thing, if I did that thing, and then we begin to justify it. At some point, for the vast majority of the sin in our life, it's very randomly, it doesn't just happen again. It's like somewhere along the way we've justified, well, maybe my language doesn't matter. My words don't matter. My thoughts don't matter. My deeds don't matter. And then all of a sudden, we've justified that, or it's not as bad as somebody else. I mean, it's not like I'm a mass murderer, or it's not like I'm, the person who was embezzling money, or it's not like I'm that guy who's done this.
It could be worse. I could be.
Yeah, it could be. Yeah,
I joked with my mom in high school about that. Like, Mom, I could have done this. Okay, right. I could be off doing this. You're lucky.
Yes, you're very lucky. I overheard a teenager recently the parent, I was in a conversation with a group of parents, and one of the parents asked their teenager to come over, and the teenager comes over, and the mom says, "Hey, what are you doing?" And she's like, "Drugs." You know, just like, and she wasn't, obviously, but she was just like so annoyed by the fact that her mom would like ask her what she was doing in front of this other group of people, you know, so she just, you know, but that idea of eventually, after we've justified enough, we make those choices to disobey God and live in sin. And that's exactly what Achan did. And because of that, you know, that kind of big idea I got to was that, you know, our sin doesn't affect just us, right? It affects the people around us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so then that was kind of like the main idea that we talked about yesterday. And I think I think we talked about this a little earlier. That's just not something I think we frame up a lot. Like you mentioned, the way we sometimes talk about sin, like at its fundamental level, it is anything that I do that is outside of like God's plan for people, right? God's plan for relationships. And it's usually those types of things because like, if I do this, that is going to affect my relationship with you or with my wife or with my family or friends or whoever, right? These are like, that's the like sin has effects that it kind of like goes out, but sometimes we talk about it like it's this thing it's personal, it's just to me, and it's kind of like my own secret, my own thing in my tent, and it just doesn't really always function that way. I think that's kind of like it's like looking through sin through like a keyhole of just this thing that only affects me, but in reality the effects ripple out into like lots of different ways, whether that's like then how you treat people, you're hiding things from people that gets you to lie more, and these are affecting, right? So you just see how like the ripples can just start growing out of this one thing.
And I think, James, too, like one of the things about hidden sin, what it does is it causes people to withdraw. Right? There's a lot of times where somebody knows they're sinning and then they find ways to withdraw. And another way of saying that is they quit giving their best. Right. Maybe they quit serving people. Maybe they quit, interacting with their spouse. Maybe they quit interacting with their kids because they think, I don't want to be known. I don't want this to be found out that I'm maybe stealing at work or giving myself over to lustful thoughts or, I think I've lived long enough and seen enough relationships where a secret relationship has been started, and their spouse may say, man, something's just wrong. Something's off. They can't figure out what it is. But then later you find out that this person or the other person had another relationship going, but they were withdrawing. And it's just, you look at the story of Achan and the lesson here that I think God has for the nation of Israel at this time, and I think for us, is that we should be aware, that our sin does have consequence, both to our relationship with God, but also to the lives of others. And so we kind of talked about what do we do about that?
Yeah. Yeah, and so we kind of had these three things that you talked about, and so the first one was identify your sin. Yep. Can you unpack that a little bit for us? How do we do that?
Man, I think for many of us, it's just putting a name on it. I think, James, like if I said, James, do you know what sins you struggle with most? Yeah. My guess is you could probably, and I think anybody, whether they're a believer or not, just about everybody would go, well, yeah, here's where I sin. For some, it's being maybe incredibly selfish and they're not generous the way God calls them to be generous with their time or their resources. Maybe it's that those many varying forms of greed or about rage and anger. The Bible tells us not to be that. Drunkenness. Yeah. Lust, we could go down the list of things that most of us can like, okay, let's identify it. So admittedly, step one yesterday was like something everybody should be able to do. Identify your sin. Okay, what is it? But then it's taking it to that next level of confess your sin.
Yep. Yeah. So that's the second part of this is confessing your sin. And so when we confess our sin, like how are we supposed to do that? How does the Bible tell us, like, is this something that I just say to God? Like, how can you tell us a little bit of what does that look like?
To me, there's a couple verses that I shared yesterday that have just been lifelong passages for me about that explain what confession is. In the book of 1 John, it says, if we confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive us our sins and purify us from all unrighteousness. So if we confess, there's that qualifying word, if we confess our sins, he is faithful and just. And to me, that's just the word confession literally means like to name it before God, to say what it is and to bring it. It's like, I think the root word, if I remember right, is like an apology. Like, God, I'm sorry. God, I'm confessing this to you. Here is what I've done. And I shared yesterday a little bit. I had a mentor back when I was about 20 years old who told me to be very specific with God when confessing sin. So like if I said a cuss word, that day with my friends joking around. What does it look like to say, like, God, I feel like I caused my friends to stumble. I brought your name down because they know I follow you. I'm trying to put you first. And God, I said the beep word, that began to change the way that I view the language that I used with others, and then conversely, like any sin, you name it, to say, like, what if I actually got very specific and detailed with the Lord in my prayer time? So if I confess my sins, then I believe he's faithful and just to forgive my any sin.
Yeah, and so that's really good. I think that's like a really tangible way to be able to think about it, because I think also when you kind of like what you said, like you got to put a name to it, and when you put a name to it and then you speak it, I think that's the power of, this is kind of a different topic. I think that's the power of a lot of what prayer is. God knows what's on our hearts, but when we verbalize it to him, when we say it out loud, it kind of lets me know, like also like, man, I'm acknowledging that I need God to intervene and I need God to step in. And I think like half of it is like, it's just for us. And then the other half is also like the relationship that we get with God and the access that we have. But like God knows what's going on in your heart. He knows what's going on in mine, but that's not all that prayer is. That's like a kind of a one-dimensional way. Anyway, so the third way that we kind of put this into action in our life is to do something. And so what do you mean do something? That could be that could be anything.
Well, I think, looking at this passage, it was kind of unique that Joshua was grieving. Now, it wasn't Joshua who sinned necessarily, but God had just come and said, hey,
he identified it for him.
Yeah, he identified it. And so Joshua falls to his face. He's in prayer. He's crying out to God, saying, God, why? And God says, get up. Stand up. He's like, stand up, and I need you to do something. And then they went and they identified the sin in the camp, and they did something about it. Now, there was a severe consequence then for Achan and his family. They were put to death. And many of us, we look at the Old Testament and think, I just don't understand the war and the violence and all that. But a huge part of the Old Testament in that regard is God was continually teaching that sin has severe consequence, and sin leads to death. The Bible eventually tells us it's not just a physical death, right? But there is a spiritual death. There is a separation from God. And I wish I had more time yesterday. I probably went a little bit long yesterday anyway. But the whole idea of making sure we understand like where the Joshua 8:1 takes us is that after they took care of this sin, God says, now go back and take the territory I called you to. I want you to continue to move forward in the things that I've called you to. And I think for some of us, we sense God calling us forward. We fail. We take a step back. We sin, and we think, well, I should give up. But what does the Lord do? He says, okay, you've taken care of it. Now do something. Go back and take what I've asked you to take. And so now they go back up to Ai, and it says the Lord, he says, go ahead and go because I have already delivered you. I have delivered you. So before the battle had even happened, God says, I'm there. And I think that's a lot of what our faith journey is trusting that Christ, because of his death on the cross, he paid the penalty for our sin. And because of that, like we've been delivered. And because of that, we can move forward.
I think at the root of this whole entire story is even like what you just reminded me, the way that God kind of comes back on the back end. Like God is saying, I'm going to continue to be faithful. I'm going to do the thing I said I was going to do. And what he's really doing in this whole story is kind of holding the Israelite people accountable to, hey, you also need to be faithful. You said you would do this as well. And I'm going to hold you accountable to that in the same way that I will continue to be faithful and accountable. And so that's one thing that I think to pull out of the story, because sometimes I think we can make it about, well, what was the punishment like, And that's not the point of the story. Right. The point of the story is not like the result. The point of the story is God is who he said he was, and he's going to continue to do that. And he's asking these people who are in this covenant with him to also be faithful and to uphold this covenant, so other people will see that this people is like this God who is so different from anything in culture. That's a great point. And I think that's super interesting. And so kind of you mentioned this a little bit yesterday. It might be backing up a little bit, but when the God said to Joshua to consecrate yourselves and to dedicate yourselves, you identify these things, you confess your sin, and you do something. And so you kind of left us with this challenge of like, what does it look like in your life? What's God calling you to get up and do something? Obviously, we need to go through the process of identifying and confessing, but what's the thing that God is asking us maybe to get up and do? Like what is the thing he's holding us from or keeping us back from until we take care of in our own life? And I think that's a great question for us to rest on this week and to meditate in God's presence of what could that really mean for us?
Man, it's amazing. And again, James, I would just go back to wrapping up that thought is, again, most of us, we know what our sin is. Mm-hmm. We know where we're falling short of God's standard, from the calling that he has for us, the guidelines that he's marked out for us. So, okay, so what part of my life and how can I start taking that territory? And mm-hmm. a lot of times it is like, what do you need help with? Go confess to a friend, confess to your small group leader. Mm-hmm. You've identified the sin. Now let's confess it, but let's do something about it. Start building an action plan, mm-hmm. For what that would look like in your life. And it's incredible.
And so where are we headed this next week? What are we going to be talking about? How does this story progress?
Oh man, yeah, the story of Joshua is just incredible. I love the whole book. You see this storyline of how they continue to move forward and progress. And this week, James, we have Jason Epperson coming in town, mm-hmm. and Jason's going to be actually doing the next 2 messages for us. Cool. And so there's this incredible series of stories that happen between Joshua 7 and fast forwarding through the middle of the book of Joshua, but eventually we reach this story where the sun stands still. Mm-hmm. Like for a portion of a day, the sun mm-hmm. stands still. And it's amazing. There's actually science behind this to this day, that there's a missing gap of time in history, mm-hmm. and it's just phenomenal. So Jason will talk about that and how God can do the miraculous. And then the next weekend, eventually we're going to close out with like this calling of the nation of Israel, where eventually Joshua kind of cries out and says, man, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. So mm-hmm. the next couple of weeks, we'll kind of fast forward to the remaining 20 or so chapters of the book of Joshua with those 2 stories.
Awesome. Well, I'm looking forward to it. It's going to continue to be a great series. And I think there's a lot of good questions that we need to continue to look like. What does it look like for our life to walk in faith, to stand in the river? And then today we talked about, what does it look like to get up and do something, and what is God calling us to? And we're going to continue to unpack some great stories throughout this book. And so thank you everyone for joining us today for this episode of Follow Up, and we look forward to seeing you next week.